Millionaire CEO was walking past the hospital, but what the crying girl said to him broke his heart. Watch until the end, because the moment she hands him a paper plane will stay with you forever. And before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. The hospital loomed like a glass fortress against the fading skyline, its mirrored windows catching the last of the golden hour and tossing fractured light back into the street below. Damian Rhodes stepped out of the back seat of the black town car, the door pulled open by his silent driver before the vehicle had even fully stopped. The air was sharp for early spring, cool enough to make his breath cloud slightly as he adjusted the cuffs of his gray overcoat and glanced at the time. His silver watch caught the last rays of sunlight flashing briefly like a beacon. He was not supposed to be here. Not really. The evening press conference had been relocated to another wing of the hospital complex, a modern research annex built partially with funds from his company's foundation. The hospital was meant to be a symbol tonight, a backdrop for a photo opportunity that would announce a groundbreaking partnership between Rhodes BioCare and the state's largest medical network. Damian was the architect of the deal, and its face. Every camera was already waiting, but he had asked the driver to take him around the long way. He did not say why, and no one questioned him. Even now, at 43, with salt at his temples and tailored wool hugging his shoulders, Damian walked with the kind of quiet authority that silenced most questions before they formed. His steps echoed against the pavement as he passed the emergency entrance, eyes drawn upward to the flashing red light of an ambulance just pulling away. It wasn't the sounds that made him pause. It was the stillness. Just beyond the hospital's east entrance, near a row of concrete planters filled with dying tulips and cigarette butts, a small figure was hunched beside the wall. It might have been mistaken for a pile of clothes at first. But something in the shape made him stop. He turned slightly. Then, as if moved by some instinct that cut beneath years of emotional discipline, he walked toward it. The child did not move. Damian approached, slowly crouching as he neared. She was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7, with tangled brown hair and a too-thin hoodie pulled up over her head. Her knees were drawn tightly to her chest and her arms wrapped around them in a way that seemed too practiced. She wasn't crying loudly. Her shoulders trembled with the kind of restrained sobs that had no sound left to offer. Damian spoke softly. "Hey, are you all right?" The girl flinched at the sound of his voice but did not look up. He waited, patient. A long moment passed. Then slowly she lifted her head. Her face was streaked with dried tears, her eyes impossibly large, in a face that looked far too old for her years. She stared at him, not with fear but with something else, something searching. She studied his face, his coat, the silver glint of his watch. Then she whispered, with a steadiness that broke him in half. She said you'd come. Right before she closed her eyes. Damian froze. The words hit harder than he expected, not just because of their meaning, but because of the certainty behind them. He knelt fully now, lowering himself until they were eye level. "Who said that?" The girl blinked slowly. "My mom, before they took her away in the ambulance. She told me if I stayed right here, someone would come. She said to wait for the man with the silver watch." Damian's hand twitched. He looked down at his wrist, the polished face of the watch gleaming against the dimming light. He had worn it for years, a gift from his late sister, the only person he had ever let all the way in. He looked back at the girl, heart suddenly beating too hard. "What's your name?" "Sophie." She said it like she had said it 1,000 times in her life, but only now remembered it mattered. "How old are you, Sophie?" "I think 7. But Mommy says I'm 8 when I'm bossy." She tried to smile, but it wobbled and collapsed. Damian felt a sharp sting in his chest. "Where is your mom now?" The girl looked toward the ER doors. "I don't know. They wouldn't let me ride with her. A nurse said someone would come get me. But nobody did. So I waited like Mommy said. She said the man with the silver watch would come." The air felt suddenly too still. Damian looked around, scanning the hospital entrance, expecting a social worker, a staff member, anyone. But there was no one. The world was moving on. Footsteps hurrying past them, cars honking at the nearby intersection, and here sat a little girl who had been left alone because someone assumed someone else would care. "Do you have anyone else, grandparents, a neighbor?" Sophie shook her head. "Just Mommy, just us, always." Damien hesitated for less than a second. Then he stood and held out his hand. "Would it be all right if I waited with you? Maybe helped you find her." Sophie didn't take his hand at first. She studied him again, her eyes sharp despite the exhaustion in her limbs. "You're not a stranger. I think I'm someone your mom knew a long time ago. Maybe not for very long. But if she said I'd come, then I should probably make sure I deserve that kind of faith." Sophie nodded. Then she reached up and took his hand. It was small and dry like crumpled paper, but she held on tightly. Damien turned toward the ER entrance, leading her gently through the sliding doors. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale, washed-out glow. A nurse behind the desk looked up, startled to see a child reappear with a man in an expensive coat. He introduced himself, asking for information on a woman named Elena. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Her full name is Elena Meyer." The nurse typed quickly, then paused. "The woman was brought in about an hour ago. She's in the ICU now. No listed emergency contacts. The child was found outside earlier, but we weren't sure what to do yet. Someone from child welfare has been notified." Damien felt his stomach turn. He thanked the nurse and turned toward Sophie. She stood very still beside him, her chin lifted, her hands clenched in the pockets of her jacket. "What does ICU mean?" she asked. "It means she's getting help. The best kind." Sophie nodded once. Her face didn't change, but her fingers found his again. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly. "I promise." She didn't answer, but she let herself lean just slightly against his leg. They waited in a small corner of the lobby, where Damien made a call to cancel the press conference without explanation. He lowered himself into the vinyl chair beside Sophie, who had curled up beside him, still clutching the backpack she had with her. After a long silence, she spoke again. "Mommy writes a lot in her journal. It's about everything, about me, about someone she met before I was born." Damien turned to her slowly. "She said he saved her life once, a long time ago. She wrote about him all the time. She said he had sad eyes but kind hands." Sophie unzipped the small bag and pulled out a leather-bound book. It was weathered, the corners soft with use. She held it out to him. The first page had a name written in small, careful cursive. Damien Rhodes. His breath caught. His heart thudded like it had been kicked. Sophie watched him wide-eyed. "You're him, right?" The man she waited for. Damien could barely speak. "I think so." Then she nodded like that was enough. Like the weight of 7 years waiting had just shifted. They sat in silence again. The journal between them, and Damien realized this was not just a child asking for help. This was a tether being handed back to him from a past he barely remembered, from a moment he had dismissed as fleeting, but that had changed everything. "She said you'd come." The words echoed in his mind, soft and haunting. And here he was, late for everything that once mattered, but right on time for what would matter now. The journal felt heavier than its size suggested. Damien held it in his lap like it might disintegrate if he touched it too quickly. But Sophie had placed it there with purpose. She had not handed it to him as a child offering a treasure. She had offered it like someone delivering a key. Outside the lobby windows, the evening was deepening into dusk, the street lamps beginning to flicker alive, and the hospital's emergency entrance glowing in solemn red. Inside, the usual shuffle of nurses, the static whine of pagers, and the low hum of televisions created the kind of muted chaos only hospitals know. But in that little corner where they sat, it felt like time had slowed. Damien traced the handwriting on the first page. His name, not just a note or a reminder, his full name in Elena's cursive. He remembered that name now. Elena, the woman from the grief circle 8 years ago. The one who had sat across from him in a cold folding chair, hands folded in her lap, and listened when he could barely breathe. They had both lost someone, He had lost his sister to a sudden cardiac arrest. She had lost her mother to cancer. They were strangers in that room, held together by silence and the need to feel something human. They had spoken after the session ended, not in desperation but in relief. She had made him laugh once, just once. He remembered that. They had coffee that turned into a walk that turned into one night in his apartment where no promises were made, but something soft and wordless had passed between them. He remembered the curve of her smile, how she had written her number on a napkin but never answered when he called. He had assumed she had moved on or regretted it. He never chased. And now here he sat with her daughter. Sophie leaned against his side, head resting just above his arm. She had not spoken in a while, but her presence was steady. She wasn't the kind of child who needed to fill silence. She let it stretch and settle like someone used to being invisible. Damien opened the journal slowly. The first entry was dated 3 weeks after their night together. The words were brief but clear. I met someone the night I thought I was done feeling anything. His name is Damien. He said almost nothing, but his silence felt safe. We shared stories like secrets. And then we didn't speak again. But something stayed with me. I feel different. I feel like maybe I'm not alone. Damien turned the page. More entries followed, not daily, but consistent. The tone shifted from reflections on grief to entries about morning sickness, doctor visits, working 2 jobs. She had not written his name after the first few months, but she had written about the baby, about Sophie, about the kind of mother she wanted to be, about nights when she was too tired to cry, about teaching her daughter to be strong but not hard. Damien read until his eyes blurred, then closed the book gently. Sophie looked up at him. "Did you know about me?" she asked. "No." His voice cracked on the single word. "I didn't. Would you have come if you did?" Damien turned to her, his face open. "Yes. 1,000 times, yes." Sophie nodded. She believed him. He wasn't sure how or why, but she did. A nurse approached, then a different one this time, her expression alert but kind. "You're with Elena Meyer." Damien stood. "Yes, I'm with her daughter." The nurse looked down at Sophie and smiled, then back at him. "She's stabilized. Still unconscious, but her vitals are stronger than when she arrived. We've moved her to ICU 4. You can see her briefly, but only one of you at a time." Damien looked at Sophie. "Do you want to go in first?" Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't like seeing her with the tubes. It makes her look like she's not breathing even though she is." Damien nodded. "I'll check on her and then come back all right." Sophie agreed, curling deeper into the chair with the journal clutched to her chest. He followed the nurse through a maze of sterile corridors. The ICU ward smelled faintly of antiseptic and coffee, a mix of urgency and exhaustion. Room 4 was small, dimly lit. Elena lay on the hospital bed, pale against the stark whiteness of the sheets. Her hair was longer than he remembered, darker, tangled on the pillow. Her face was thinner, drawn by illness, but unmistakable. Damien stepped into the room like a man entering sacred ground. He did not speak. There was nothing to say that her unconscious body could hear. He simply sat. He studied the way her hand rested on the blanket, limp but not lifeless. The IV ran steady into her arm. Machines hummed gently, reading numbers he could not decipher but hoped meant something good. After a long moment, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I never forgot you," he said quietly. "I just didn't know what to do with how much it mattered." He looked at her face. "And now I'm here. I don't know what happens next, but I'm here." He sat with her a little longer, watching the rise and fall of her chest, each breath an unspoken prayer. When he returned to the lobby, Sophie was asleep, curled like a kitten in the vinyl chair, the journal still pressed to her chest. Damien didn't wake her. He sat beside her and pulled out his phone. He didn't call anyone. He just stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then finally he called Charles. His older brother answered on the 3rd ring, his voice already tense. "Damien, it's late. I'm at the hospital." "You okay? There's a little girl. Her name is Sophie. She's..." Elena Meyer's daughter. Charles was silent for a beat. The woman from years ago. From the support group? Yes. Charles exhaled slowly. Damien, we've been through this. You remember what happened before? Yes. But this is different. Is it? Charles's voice was tight. You have a weakness for guilt. That's not a judgment. It's just true. And you're not thinking clearly. Damien looked down at Sophie asleep with her knees drawn up. She had tucked the edges of the journal like it was armor. I think I'm finally thinking clearly for the first time in years. There was a pause. Then Charles said, Be careful, and hung up. Damien put the phone away. He looked at Sophie, the weight of the journal, the soft rise and fall of her breath. He took off his coat and draped it gently over her shoulders. The hospital hummed around them. But inside that corner of waiting room light he stayed. Just a man and a child joined by a journal and the memory of one night that had never really ended. The sun had not fully risen when Sophie stirred. Damien had not moved from his seat, though his back ached and his legs were stiff from the long hours spent in a vinyl chair. He had watched over her all night, waking only briefly each time a nurse walked past, or the intercom beeped softly in the distance. Sophie blinked up at him, bleary-eyed and confused for a moment, until her gaze landed on the coat draped over her like a blanket. Then she sat up, clutching the journal and rubbing her eyes with the back of one hand. You didn't leave, she said quietly. Her voice was still hoarse from sleep. Damien shook his head. No. I told you I wouldn't. Sophie looked around the waiting area. The sky beyond the window was beginning to shift from dark to gray, a soft blue creeping along the edges of the city skyline. The hospital staff was starting to move more briskly now, the day shift taking over, clipboards being exchanged, coffee cups being refilled. Are you hungry? Damien asked. She nodded slowly. What do you like for breakfast? Sophie thought for a moment, then answered French toast. With strawberries. Damien chuckled. I can't promise strawberries, but I'll find us something. Wait here. He left briefly and returned with a tray of warm food from the hospital cafeteria. Scrambled eggs, toast, and 2 small cartons of milk. Sophie picked at the toast, but ate more than he expected. She ate quietly every few bites, looking toward the hallway as if listening for news she would not receive. When they finished, he folded the tray aside and leaned forward. Would you want to come home with me for a while, just until your mom wakes up? Sophie hesitated. What about the people who were supposed to come get me? Damien paused. They might still call, but I can make sure they know you're safe. She narrowed her eyes. Would they take me away from her? He did not want to lie. They might, if they think she can't take care of you. Sophie's mouth set into a tight line. She held up the journal. But she does take care of me. She takes notes about everything. She writes down my meds and my allergies and even which shoes I hate. I know she does, Damien said. But sometimes people don't look closely enough. Sometimes they only see what's missing. Sophie looked at him, studying his face again like she had the night before. You're not just helping because you feel bad, are you? He shook his head. No. I'm helping because it matters. Because you matter. And because I think your mom once mattered to me more than I realized. Sophie's expression softened. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod. Okay, but only if I can keep my journal with me. Deal. Damien made the arrangements quickly. His assistant, startled, but efficient, secured a temporary caregiver who could help supervise Sophie during the hours he was pulled into unavoidable meetings. Her name was Marta, a retired nurse in her 60s, with a warm smile and no-nonsense posture. She arrived at his apartment before they did with a small suitcase of supplies and a bag of groceries that she insisted on paying for herself. I always keep a few essentials packed, she told Damien at the door. Grandkids live out of state, and I get called in for situations like this more often than you'd think. His penthouse apartment was not made for children. It was all glass and shadow, the floors a polished slate that echoed with each step. But Sophie walked in without hesitation, turning in a slow circle as she took it all in, Her eyes landed on the tall windows that looked out over the skyline, then on the marble countertop that held no signs of life, no magnets or notes or clutter. "It's very clean," she said finally. Damien laughed. "That's because no one's ever made a mess in it. You can change that if you want." Sophie blinked, then smiled slightly. Challenge accepted. He gave her a guest room down the hall from his. It was bare except for the bed and a dresser, but Sophie didn't seem to mind. She pulled out the journal and placed it on the nightstand, then took out a single folded photograph from one of the back pages. It showed her and Elena at a park, their arms wrapped around each other, a dog in the background with a crooked tail. She tucked it into the mirror's frame like a silent guardian. Damien watched her do it without interrupting. He spent the rest of the morning canceling non-essential meetings and shifting deadlines. His team was surprised, but too well trained to press for explanations. By the afternoon, he had settled into a rhythm he had never known he needed. He made Sophie a peanut butter sandwich with too much peanut butter, and forgot to cut the crusts, which she pointed out with mock severity. He apologized, and she forgave him after exactly one bite. Marta sat with her afterward and read aloud from a mystery book about a girl detective who solved cases with her dog. Damien listened from the kitchen, the sound of their voices echoing strangely in a home that had never known stories before. That evening he returned to the hospital. Elena was still unconscious, but her color had improved. The doctors remained cautious but optimistic. Damien sat beside her again, this time bringing the photograph Sophie had placed in the mirror. He propped it on the windowsill so Elena would see it when she woke. Then he opened the journal again and read a few more entries. March 12th. Sophie asked today why her last name wasn't the same as mine. I told her families are made of more than names, but it still made me sad. Sometimes I wish I had asked him to stay. Sometimes I think about that night and wonder if he still thinks about me. I hope he found peace. Damien closed the book. His chest ached. He reached for her hand again, resting his fingers gently over hers. I don't know why you never answered my calls, but I think you wanted me to find you. I think you left a trail, and I'm here now. He stayed until the nurse reminded him visiting hours had ended. Back home, he found Sophie asleep on the couch, curled into one side with the mystery book tucked under her arm, and a bowl of half-eaten popcorn balanced precariously on the cushion. Damien lifted her gently and carried her to bed, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders before turning off the lamp. She stirred once long enough to whisper, "Did you see her today?" He sat on the edge of the bed. "I did. She's resting." Sophie nodded. "She's waiting for me. I know she is." Then she closed her eyes and did not speak again. Damien sat beside her long after her breathing evened. He looked around the room at the way it had already begun to change. A crayon drawing sat on the dresser, a hairbrush with a few strands left behind, a pair of socks too small for anyone but her. The apartment had been designed for silence and solitude, but now it held traces of someone else, someone small and brave and watching. That night Damien did not sleep much. He walked through his own home like a guest, noticing how empty it had always been. Not cold exactly, just untouched. He found himself standing at the window as the city lights twinkled far below, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was no longer above it all. He was inside something, part of something, not because he had planned it, but because one little girl had waited outside a hospital with a journal and a promise, and believed in someone enough to stay. The days that followed began to settle into something that felt deceptively normal. Every morning, Damien woke up just before the sun cracked the horizon and padded barefoot across the stone floors of his apartment to check on Sophie. Without fail, she was already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed or at the small writing desk he had moved into the corner of her room. Her journal was always open. Sometimes she was sketching little diagrams of things she had read about the day before. Sometimes she was writing quietly, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to a voice only she could hear. He never interrupted her. Instead, he would go into the kitchen and attempt breakfast. By the third morning, Sophie had taught him how to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl and how to tell when toast was going to burn. He made mistakes. She called them disasters. They both laughed harder than either of them expected. Marta had settled in comfortably as well. She had an easy way with Sophie, not patronizing, not overbearing, just calm and steady. She helped with homework, brushed through tangles without complaint, and kept Damien updated on everything from laundry needs to which snacks Sophie preferred. It was Marta who told him on the fourth day as she sipped her tea and glanced toward the hallway where Sophie was humming a tune from the radio. "She's not an ordinary kid, you know." Damien raised an eyebrow. "How do you mean she's sharp? Observes everything." "Most children that age react," Sophie calculates, "like she's always 3 steps ahead and waiting for you to notice." Damien nodded slowly. "I've noticed. She doesn't miss much." "That's not always good," Marta said. "Sometimes kids like that carry more than they should. They try to be in control of things no one should expect them to carry." Damien looked away for a moment. "I think she's had to." Marta finished her tea without speaking again. That evening, Damien returned to the hospital as he did every night. Elena's condition remained unchanged but stable. Her vitals were improving, her breathing more consistent, and the nurses had begun speaking with cautious optimism. Still, she did not wake. Damien sat beside her bed in the low evening light and read her more entries from the journal quietly, as if reading to a room full of people who could hear but had not yet found their voices. He brought Sophie's latest drawing as well. A crooked picture of a fox in a superhero cape with the caption underneath that read, "You're stronger than anyone thinks." He taped it to the wall beside Elena's bed. On the 5th day, as Damien left the hospital with a coffee cup in hand and exhaustion clinging to his shoulders, he found his brother waiting for him in the parking lot. Charles Rhodes stood beside his black sedan with his arms crossed and a look that was part concern, part condemnation. Damien stopped short. "You tracked me here." "You stopped answering your phone," Charles said. "That's usually a sign you're in trouble." "I'm fine. That's not what the board said." "The board?" Damien's jaw tightened. "What does the board have to do with this?" Charles took a few steps forward, words spreading. Rhodes BioCare's CEO disappears for a week, cancels 3 meetings, and is seen escorting a child in and out of the hospital without explanation. Someone finally put 2 and 2 together. Damien narrowed his eyes. "I'm taking care of someone. Someone who might be my daughter." Charles sighed heavily. "Damien, this isn't the first time you've believed that. Remember Charlotte? That was different. She lied. She manipulated. And how do you know this isn't the same? Because Sophie isn't lying, and neither is Elena." Charles's tone shifted. "You don't know that. You don't even know her anymore. You met her once." Damien stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "I may have only known her one night, but I know what kind of person she was. And I've read every word she wrote since." Charles looked away, jaw clenched. "What happens if she dies, Damien? What happens when you're left holding the pieces of someone else's life and no legal claim to the child who believes you're everything? Are you ready for that?" Damien didn't answer. He did not have to. The silence said enough. Charles shook his head. "Just be sure this isn't about guilt. Be sure this isn't about trying to fix something you didn't break." Then he got into his car and drove away. That night, Damien sat in the living room staring out the window as Sophie slept a few feet away, curled into a blanket with one leg kicked out and a hand wrapped tightly around the strap of her journal. He thought about what Charles had said, about mistakes, about guilt, about how easy it was to drown in the wreckage of good intentions. But this didn't feel like guilt. It felt like gravity. The next day, Sophie asked to visit the hospital. Damien was surprised, but agreed. Marta packed a small bag of snacks and a coloring book, and they drove in quiet until they pulled into the garage near the ICU entrance. Sophie walked through the hallways like she had memorized them from her dreams. She greeted the receptionist by name, waved shyly at a nurse who recognized her, and stood quietly outside Elena's room as Damien checked on her. When the nurse finally nodded, he opened the door. Sophie stepped inside. The room was quiet except for the beeping of the heart monitor. Elena looked peaceful but pale, her skin almost translucent against the white linens. Sophie approached slowly, then climbed onto the chair beside the bed and reached for her mother's hand. It felt warm, but still. "Hi, Mommy," she whispered. "I brought your favorite socks, the ones with the yellow stars." Damien watched as she gently unfolded a pair of worn cotton socks and laid them across Elena's feet. "I didn't want your toes to be cold." Then she looked up. Her voice was small but steady. "She's going to wake up right." Damien nodded, crossing the room. "The doctors say she's getting stronger." Sophie looked down again. "Good, because I have so many things to tell her." They stayed like that for nearly an hour. When Sophie finally stood, she looked at her mother one more time and whispered something Damien could not hear. Then she turned and walked out of the room. In the hallway, she looked up at him. "Did you mean it when you said you think she matters to you?" Damien met her eyes. "Yes, I meant it." Then Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. It was a drawing of 3 stick figures standing under a tree, one tall, one medium, one small, all holding hands. Underneath, she had written, "Maybe we could be a family." Damien took the drawing gently and looked at her. "Maybe we already are." That night when he tucked her in, she whispered, "If she doesn't wake up, can I still stay?" Damien's voice caught, but he managed to say, "You can stay as long as you want, forever, if that's what you choose." Sophie nodded and turned over, curling into her blanket. Damien sat beside her until she slept, watching the rhythm of her breathing, and wondering how something so small could make everything else in his life feel either irrelevant or brand new. In the silence of the apartment, he pulled out the drawing again. He looked at the 3 stick figures. A family, something he had never imagined for himself, something he had never dared to want. Until now. The 6th morning in Damien's penthouse began with rain tapping softly against the massive windows. It was not the kind of storm that demanded attention, but rather the quiet sort, the one that seemed to slow the world just enough for people to notice themselves breathing. Damien was already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to his forearms, standing over a pan of scrambled eggs that Sophie had deemed an acceptable breakfast after many failures involving burnt toast and suspiciously hard pancakes. The apartment smelled faintly of butter and cinnamon from Marta's latest experiment with French toast, and Sophie was sitting at the counter, her chin resting in one hand, while her other drew lazy circles across a napkin. She looked more rested now, less wary, though she still carried herself like someone always halfway prepared for disappointment. Damien had started to learn the signs, when she bit her lip instead of asking for something, when she looked at the door after a phone call, when her smile came with hesitation. He had begun keeping a running list in his mind of all the little things that made her feel safe. The purple mug with the chipped handle, the lullaby she hummed when nervous, the way she always looked for his coat on the hook when she came home as if it were a sign that he had not left. After breakfast, Marta took Sophie to a bookstore downtown. Damien had a few hours free and used them to return to the hospital. He walked the now familiar hallway toward the ICU, nodding at nurses who had grown used to seeing him there. Elena had not yet woken, but her strength was returning. Her breathing no longer required assistance, and the doctors now spoke with cautious optimism that she would regain consciousness any day. The room was dim and quiet. Damien took his usual place beside the bed, reaching instinctively for her hand. It felt warmer now, less fragile. He sat in silence for a while, listening to the rhythm of the monitors. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the journal. He had read nearly all of it in the evenings in the quiet stretches after Sophie had gone to sleep. But there was one section he had not yet opened, tucked into the back cover beneath the binding. Marta had discovered it by accident, helping Sophie place a bookmark the night before. She had pointed it out to Damien and simply said, "I think this part was meant for you." Damien peeled back the leather edge and felt the paper give slightly, revealing a thin envelope sealed with a strip of faded tape. On the front, in the same looping handwriting as the rest of the journal, were the words, "For the man I met when I needed saving." His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. The letter was handwritten. The ink faded in a few places, but the words were clear. "Dear Damien, I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not know if life will ever bring us back to the same place at the same time, but I had to write it even if it was only for myself. That night changed me. I know it might not have meant much to you in the long run. Maybe it was just one more conversation in a string of broken days. But for me, it was the first moment in months that I felt like I could breathe again, like someone had seen me without flinching. You listened when you did not have to. You sat in silence when words would have broken me. You let me cry without asking for the reason. And when you touched my hand that night when we sat in your apartment and watched the city lights without speaking, I felt something shift. I never expected to see you again. When I found out I was pregnant, I did not know what to do. I was scared. Not just of being alone, but of what it would mean to bring a child into a world where I had nothing but memories and rent bills. I tried to find you once. I looked up your name, found the company, but I convinced myself you were too far away, too powerful, too unreachable. I was just a name on a sign-in sheet from a grief group you probably never thought about again. So, I made a choice. I chose to raise Sophie with the only things I had: my hands, my stories, my memories of you. I told her stories about the man with the silver watch, the man who once saved me without realizing it. I never used your name. I just called you the man who listens. She liked that. She used to draw pictures of you based on how I described you. I do not know what you will do with this. I do not know what it means to you now. But if you are reading this, then you found her. Or maybe she found you. Either way, thank you for being the kind of person I always hoped you were. And if something happens to me, please don't let her feel alone. Let her know she was loved, deeply, fiercely, every single day. Elena Damien stared at the letter for a long time. The air in the room felt thick with memory, as if the space between him and the past had narrowed to nothing. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to its place in the journal. Then he looked at Elena. Her face was calm, her breathing even. He reached for her hand again and held it tightly. You should know, he whispered, she's brilliant and stubborn and already correcting my grammar. I think she gets that from you. He sat there for a long while, letting the weight of the words settle over him like a second skin. When he returned to the apartment, Sophie was sitting on the couch with a new book open in her lap and a bowl of sliced apples at her side. She looked up when he walked in. Did she wake up? Damien shook his head gently. Not yet, but soon. Sophie nodded and returned to her book. Damien sat beside her. She leaned slightly into his side. I drew another picture today, she said. Want to see always. She handed him a folded piece of paper. It showed a tree house with 3 windows each, with a stick figure smiling out of it. One wore a tie. One had a ponytail. The smallest wore glasses. There was a sun in the corner and a cat with no name sitting on the roof. Damien smiled. This is amazing. I call it our hideout. In case we ever need to disappear for a while. Damien looked at her. Why would we need to disappear? Sophie shrugged. Just in case people try to take me away. You know, like the people from before. Damien felt a tightness in his chest. He reached over and placed a hand on her back. No one is taking you away. I won't let them. She nodded, still staring at the drawing. Promise? I promise. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Damien sat alone on the balcony. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed and glistening beneath the streetlights. He held the journal in his hands, the weight of it no longer a burden but a vow. He did not know what would come next. He did not know how to fight what might be coming. But he knew this. He had been given a second chance, and this time he would not waste it. The next morning the city woke under a pale sun smeared behind low clouds. Damien's apartment buzzed with quiet routines. Marta moved through the kitchen preparing breakfast, while the aroma of toasted bread and brewed coffee curled through the penthouse. Sophie sat at the dining table, her feet swinging above the floor, as she concentrated on the crossword puzzle Damien had printed for her. Her brow was furrowed in the way that had become familiar to him over the past few days, a mixture of determination and quiet calculation. She was unusually clever for her age, not just in the academic sense, but in the ways she read people. Damien had begun to notice how she scanned rooms before speaking, how she observed before acting, how she tested words like someone who had learned too early that some promises did not stick. He had just finished his second cup of coffee when Marta approached with her phone in hand. "There is a man downstairs asking to see you. He says his name is Charles." Damien stiffened slightly. "Did he say what it was about?" Marta shook her head. "Only that it was important, and that you would understand." Damien thanked her and walked to the elevator, thoughts already turning. Charles was not the kind of man who made unplanned visits. His older brother was precise, controlled, and operated like the world was a spreadsheet waiting to be balanced. If Charles was here, it meant he had discovered something or intended to stop something. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, Damien saw him standing near the entrance, still in the tailored gray suit he wore even on weekends, his expression unreadable. Charles turned as Damien approached. "You look tired," he said instead of hello. Damien gave a small smile. "Raising a kid will do that." Charles did not return the smile. "I need to talk to you privately. Now." Damien gestured toward one of the side lounges, a quiet corner paneled with bookshelves and leather chairs. They sat. Charles folded his hands. "You're not thinking clearly. I let it go when you first mentioned this child. I assumed it was a short-term impulse, but now I see it's more than that." Damien studied him carefully. "Her name is Sophie, and she's my daughter. Maybe, maybe not. There is no proof of paternity. You're just assuming based on a journal and one encounter from nearly a decade ago." Damien's voice remained even. "I'm not assuming, I'm believing. And I don't need a test to know she's mine." Charles leaned forward. "You need to understand something. There are people watching you. You're the face of the company. Your decisions reflect on all of us. Taking in a child with no legal claim, moving her into your home, making financial arrangements, it raises questions." Damien's jaw tightened. "What questions?" "That I have a heart, that I'm finally acting like a human being instead of a brand." Charles's tone turned colder. "It's not just about image. There are custody concerns, background checks, the mother is in a coma, and there are other relatives." Damien stood sharply. "What relatives? You never said there were others." Charles hesitated, then sighed. "The mother has a half-sister. Her name is Meredith. She filed an inquiry with Family Services last year but was denied due to instability in her financial history. She lives in Pennsylvania. Small town. But word got out about your involvement. She's resurfaced, and she's coming to New York." Damien stared at him. "Why? Why now?" "Because people don't always act out of love. Sometimes they act out of opportunity. Meredith knows who you are. She knows your name, your net worth, your profile, and she wants the girl. Not because she cares, but because the situation has changed." Damien's voice dropped. "Sophie is not a prize to be claimed. She is a person, a child, my child, and I won't let her be taken by someone who only wants a piece of what she thinks I am." Charles stood too. "Then you'd better prepare, because if this goes to court, it won't be about what you believe. It'll be about what you can prove. And right now, all you have is a journal and a name on a birth certificate that does not include yours." They stood in silence, two brothers facing each other with a chasm between them. Finally, Charles said, "Just be careful. You've spent your whole life building something solid. Don't let emotion crack the foundation." And he left. Damien remained there for a moment, the weight of the conversation sinking into his bones. He returned to the apartment to find Sophie finishing her puzzle, a small smudge of ink on her cheek. She looked up. "Is everything okay?" He smiled. "Everything's fine." But he knew it wasn't. Not yet. That night, after dinner and stories and brushing teeth after Sophie had curled beneath the covers and asked for the lights to be left half on, Damien stood on the balcony, phone in hand. He called his lawyer. "I need to talk custody options," he said. "Emergency guardianship if possible. I want to protect her, no matter what it takes." The lawyer said they would get started first thing in the morning. As Damien hung up, he noticed something strange. A shadow near the lobby gate. He stepped back inside and checked the security camera feed. There, standing just beyond the threshold, was a woman in her late 30s with a duffel bag slung across her shoulder and a look of calculation behind her tired eyes. Meredith. She had come faster than expected. Damien stared at the screen. Her arrival was no longer a warning. It was the beginning of something else. The next day, Meredith knocked on the door of his penthouse. She was lean with dark hair pulled into a ponytail, clothes practical and worn. She smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be Damien." He let her in. Sophie was at a tutoring session with Marta, and he was grateful for the timing. Meredith wasted no time. "I know this is complicated," she said, "but I'm family. Blood. And I believe Sophie should be with someone who actually knew her mother." Damien studied her. "Did you know Elena well?" Meredith blinked. "We were close as kids, but life pulled us apart. Still, I think family should stay with family." Damien crossed his arms. "And what about now? Where have you been these past years?" She looked down. "Trying to get back on my feet. I made mistakes. But I want to do right now." Damien remained still. "She's not a burden to be fixed. She's a child. She's smart and cautious, and she remembers who shows up." Meredith shifted uncomfortably. "I just want a chance, that's all. Give me a few days with her. Let me reconnect. I can prove I care." Damien did not answer right away. He had learned enough in business to read what people said when they thought no one was listening. Meredith's tone was too smooth, her concern too rehearsed. He saw through the performance, and yet he also knew that legally she had grounds. If he denied access without proper cause, it could work against him. So he nodded slowly. "You can see her? Here. Supervised." Meredith's eyes lit up. "Of course. That's fair. I just want what's best." As she left, Damien felt the chill of what was coming. The next chapter would not be quiet. It would be a test of truth, of love, of who had the right to stay and who had the courage to fight. Upstairs, Sophie had returned from tutoring. She saw the worry on his face and tilted her head. Who was that lady? Damien knelt beside her. "Someone who says she knew your mom. But we're going to take it slow. You get to decide what feels safe." Sophie nodded, her small hand slipping into his. "Then let's stay close," she whispered. "Like puzzle pieces." And that night, as rain began again, Damien made another silent promise. No one would pull those pieces apart. Not now. Not ever. The courtroom was colder than Damien expected, not just in temperature but in atmosphere. The walls were pale, the benches worn, and the faint echo of shuffling papers and squeaking shoes created a rhythm of anxiety beneath every breath. He sat near the front, dressed in a navy suit with no tie, his expression calm but his fingers taut against the wood of the table. To his right sat his attorney, a quiet man named Harold Vance, with spectacles perched precariously on the bridge of his nose and a demeanor as patient as time itself. Across the room, Meredith was seated with her lawyer, a younger, sharply dressed woman who had made a point of smiling too widely when she had greeted the judge earlier. Sophie was not present. Damien had insisted she be spared the ordeal. Instead, she was home with Marta and a therapist who had agreed to monitor her emotional state during the hearing. The judge, an older woman named Judge Harrow, entered briskly and wasted no time. Her voice carried clarity and no tolerance for dramatics. "We are here to determine the temporary guardianship of one Sophie Eleanor Wren, aged 7, following the incapacitation of her mother and in light of competing claims for custody." The first to speak was Meredith's attorney. She stood with rehearsed warmth, painting her client as a woman who had made mistakes, yes, but who had family ties, and had come forward as soon as she learned of the situation. She referenced Meredith's job at a local diner, her rent history, her willingness to attend parenting courses. She emphasized that blood family deserved a chance. Damien listened quietly, jaw clenched. When it was his turn, Harold rose slowly, like a man stepping onto a battlefield he had walked before. Your Honor, we do not dispute that Meredith Wren is related to the child through her late mother. What we argue is that biology alone does not constitute parental fitness. He paused, turning to the table behind them. Then he lifted the journal. This is a journal written by Elena Wren over the course of 7 years. In it, she details her relationship with my client, Mr. Damian Rhodes, as well as her decision to raise Sophie without informing him out of fear and circumstance. He handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. Damian's heart thudded as she flipped through the pages, her brows furrowing. Harold continued. My client met Elena 9 years ago at a grief support group after the death of his father. They shared one night. They did not see each other again. He did not know of Sophie's existence until a week ago when she stopped him outside a hospital with the words, "She said you'd come." The room held its breath. Harold pressed on. Since then, Mr. Rhodes has opened his home to her, provided for her, enrolled her in educational support, engaged therapists, arranged legal guardianship applications, and most importantly, built a relationship of trust and consistency with Sophie. He turned. Meredith Wren, on the other hand, filed a single inquiry with Family Services a year ago, and then disappeared. She made no further contact until she learned of Mr. Rhodes's involvement. Her sudden appearance, combined with her history of financial instability, transient housing, and inconsistent employment, raises legitimate concerns about her motives. Meredith flushed red. Her attorney stood again. Your Honor, Mr. Rhodes is a public figure, a billionaire. He has the resources to create a narrative, but resources do not equal readiness to parent. Judge Harrow held up a hand. I have read the journal. I see a woman's struggle, her fear, her attempt to shield her daughter from a world she didn't understand. I see regret, and I see hope. She turned to Damian. Mr. Rhodes, why now? Why not before Damian stood? His voice was low but unwavering. Because I didn't know. And when I found out, I didn't run. I stayed. I showed up. Every day. I cook her meals. I read her stories. I answer her questions when she's afraid. I help her understand that love is not something that disappears when it's inconvenient. And when she fell asleep last night holding a crayon drawing of the two of us flying kites, I knew I would never walk away from her again. Judge Harrow studied him, then looked to Meredith. And you? Why do you want custody? Meredith stood. Her voice shook, but not with sincerity, with effort. I messed up, but she's my family. And maybe I wasn't there when Elena was alive, but I want to be there now. I want to make things right. The judge was quiet. Then she closed the journal. I am granting temporary guardianship to Mr. Rhodes effective immediately. We will reconvene in 30 days to evaluate progress and finalize custody arrangements. Until then, Miss Wren may visit under supervised conditions. The gavel came down like thunder. The sound echoed in Damian's bones. He sat slowly exhaling for the first time in what felt like days. Meredith looked stunned. Her lawyer leaned in and whispered something sharp, but she did not respond. As the courtroom emptied, Harold turned to Damian. That was the hard part. Now comes the real one. Being the father she already believes you are. Damian nodded. I will be. That evening when he returned home, Sophie was sitting on the couch in her socks, reading a book about space. When she saw him, she ran up and hugged him without a word. He picked her up, held her close. She pulled back just enough to whisper, Did we win? He smiled. We're together. That's what matters. She nodded against his chest. Good. Because I don't want to go anywhere else. You're my puzzle piece. His throat tightened. And you're mine. After dinner, Sophie disappeared into her room. She came back holding something wrapped in tissue paper. I wanted to wait, but now's the right time. She handed it to him, carefully. Inside was a locket, old worn silver. He opened it. One side held a photo of Elena. The other side had been empty, until now. Inside was a tiny drawing Sophie had made, a stick figure with a blue tie and a kind smile. Below it were 3 words carefully written in childish block letters. My real dad. Damian blinked hard. His hands trembled as he closed the locket. "Thank you," he said. Sophie leaned against him. "I knew you'd come. Mommy said the man with the blue tie always keeps his promises." Outside the window, the city lights blinked like stars. Inside the apartment, a quiet peace settled like a warm blanket. But Damien knew it wasn't over. There would be another hearing, another test. Meredith would not give up so easily. Yet for now, they had 30 days. 30 days to build something unshakable. 30 days to show the world that love wasn't about blood or legality. It was about showing up, again and again, without being asked, without being promised, without being guaranteed, just showing up and staying. That night, as Sophie drifted to sleep holding the locket in her hands, Damien sat at the edge of her bed and opened the journal again. He found a page he had missed, a small entry written in blue ink. It read, "If anything happens to me and if he ever finds her, please let her know he was always the man I chose, even when he didn't know, even when he wasn't ready. He was always the one." Damien closed the book and kissed Sophie's forehead. "I know now," he whispered, "and I will never leave her side." The days that followed unfolded like pieces of a puzzle Sophie herself might have drawn. The apartment that once echoed with Damien's silence now pulsed with a rhythm he had never known he was missing. Breakfast became a gentle battleground between scrambled eggs and smiley-face pancakes. Mornings were no longer defined by board meetings and investor calls, but by hair ties that vanished into couch cushions and discussions about whether astronauts could bring stuffed animals to the moon. Yet beneath the soft current of new memories being made, a quiet tension lingered. Meredith's lawyer had filed for full custody. Another hearing was scheduled in just under 4 weeks. Damien knew the clock was ticking not just legally but emotionally. Every bedtime story he read, every crayon drawing he pinned to the fridge, every giggle that filled the hallways, it all deepened the stakes of what he might lose. And then came the journal again. Sophie had left it on the coffee table one afternoon while she was building a pillow fort in the living room. Damien stared at it for a long time before opening it. The worn leather cover creaked beneath his hands as if it remembered every tremble Elena's fingers had carried. He turned to a page marked by a folded corner. It was written almost 2 years ago. "Today, Sophie asked me what love feels like. I told her it feels like a sunrise you never expected, like something that warms you even when the world is cold." I wanted to tell her about him, about the night in the church basement after your father died, about the man who saw me without flinching, who didn't fix me, didn't try, just sat beside me. I wanted to say his name, but I didn't, because I made a choice. I ran, not because I didn't believe in him, but because I didn't believe I deserved him. Damien closed the journal, the weight of those words heavy in his chest. He had spent years surrounded by people who admired his mind, his wealth, his strategy. But Elena had seen something else, something quieter. And now that quiet thing was asleep in the next room, clutching a stuffed raccoon named Captain Nibbles. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Sophie stood in the kitchen with her arms folded, watching Marta cook. Marta, who had become more grandmother than housekeeper, handed her a bowl of strawberries. Sophie didn't move. "Can I ask you something?" she said, tilting her head. Marta nodded. "Of course." Sophie pointed toward the hallway. "Why does he look so sad when I'm not looking?" Marta blinked, startled. "I don't know what you mean, sweetheart." Sophie pressed her lips together, thoughtful in the way only a 7-year-old with an old soul could be. "He smiles a lot, laughs sometimes. But when I leave the room, he gets really quiet, like the kind of quiet that hurts your ears." Marta put down her knife and crouched beside her. "I think he's scared." Sophie looked surprised. "Grown-ups get scared all the time," Marta said softly. "But he's not scared of you. He's scared of losing you." Sophie stared down at her feet, then whispered, "I don't want him to be scared." That night when Damien came to tuck her in, Sophie had a plan. She reached under her pillow and handed him something. A paper plane, folded carefully, edges precise. Drawn in the center was his company's old logo, a subtle symbol he had used back when he first started out. "You told me this was your dream when you were little," she said. to fly something that helped people. He nodded, unsure where this was going. Then she pointed to the tail. There, in tiny block letters, she had written a single word. Us. Damien's breath caught. You're my dream now, she whispered. So you can't be afraid anymore. Okay. He pulled her into his arms, the paper plane between them as delicate as hope. The next morning brought a knock Damien wasn't expecting. When he opened the door, a man in a tailored gray suit stood holding an envelope. He introduced himself as Michael Carrington, representative of Senator Richard Wren's estate, Meredith's father. A powerful name, a man with deep pockets and deeper secrets. I'm here as a courtesy, Michael said smoothly. Not a threat. But the senator is interested in how quickly you've involved yourself with the child. Damien stepped aside without speaking. They sat in the study bookshelves, flanking them like silent witnesses. Michael placed the envelope on the table but didn't slide it forward. You see, Mr. Rhodes, there are things about Elena's past the senator believes may not have come to light during the hearings. Things that could complicate your claim. Damien's eyes narrowed. Are you blackmailing me? Michael held up a hand. Not at all. But let's say there are skeletons, family history, patterns of instability. The senator believes a more structured environment might be best for the girl. Perhaps a private boarding school. A legal guardian appointed from within the family. Meredith, for example. And why are you telling me this? Because you have the resources to make this easy. Walk away. Quietly. You'd be compensated. Generously. Damien stood, his voice like ice. You can tell the senator that no amount of money will take her from me. She is not a pawn in your legacy game. She is a child. My child. Michael rose unbothered. Then we'll see you in court. As he left, he glanced back once. Be careful what you uncover, Mr. Rhodes. The past has a way of biting those who dig too deep. That night, Damien sat with the journal again. This time he searched. Through page after page until he found what he didn't know he was looking for. A single page torn slightly at the corner dated 6 months before Elena died. I've started to see him. In Sophie. Not in her face, not always. But in how she stares out the window when it rains. In how she hums when she's scared. I should have told him. But Meredith said if I did, they would take her. That the family name couldn't handle it. That a scandal would follow. Damien's fingers tightened around the leather spine. He saw it now. Meredith hadn't come forward because she wanted Sophie. She had come because someone powerful had told her to. And if the journal was right, then Elena had died afraid. Not of illness, but of silence. Of being erased. And Damien knew one thing with more clarity than anything he had built in business. He would not let them erase Sophie, too. The next morning he called his investigator. I need everything, every sealed record, every hospital note, every name that visited Elena during her final weeks. I want to know what they're hiding, even if it burns me to the ground. The man on the other end of the line hesitated. That kind of digging, it'll paint a target. Damien looked out the window where Sophie was drawing chalk hearts on the pavement. Then let them aim. I won't back down. 30 days. That was all the time he had left. 30 days to gather evidence, to shield a legacy, to prepare for a war that would not be fought with numbers but with truth. And above all, 30 days to build a fortress of love around a child who had once stopped him with 5 simple words. She said you'd come. He had come. And this time he wasn't leaving. Not for anything. Not for anyone. Not even the past. And that's how a chance encounter outside a hospital turned into a love story no courtroom could erase. From a single whispered sentence to an unbreakable bond, Damien didn't just find the truth, he found his heart. If this story touched you, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you believe family is something we're born into or something we choose. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that begin with heartbreak and end with hope. And if you think this one was emotional, just wait until you hear our next story. We'll be waiting for you there. Just click on the screen now.